So let's go through the requirements and I'll show you what I've done for my step 5. So to start with, shouldn't be a surprise at this point, take your ending code from 4, set up a new folder. Do make sure you fixed anything before you move on, okay? So in other words, I would do it if I had things that I needed to do, I'd given you feedback for it, do them there. But once you copy them, fix those, and then once you copy them over, you would want to commit them into 4. I'm not going to see that, but then in 5, just do setup done, okay? And then refactor all functions to be arrow functions. We did that in the attendance, so that shouldn't be a big deal there. Remember, what I'll do is go through and search your code to see if there's functions in the code. So step 3 is in your README file, document at least 3 rules you will code. And in this case, here's some even finer requirements. But so in other words, at least one has to have multi-logic checks like the square footage and carbon footprint or like the recycle. And at least one needs to add new decision logic or functionality. And I think I'll stop here and show you mine. But before I do that, you also want to make sure that if you didn't do this during the first step, that you include the HTML validation attributes, okay? So what I'm talking about here is that, like min and max and required. So really in this case, and even though we're going to do the no validate down here, and you could do it here, it wouldn't be a big deal. Probably no, this actually is just your docs. So in this case, you just want to include any, what do you need to change? What attributes on the HTML did you need to change? Making sure that, as an example, here's inputs. I'm going to have a placeholder, but I'm not going to have any text already entered. We had that basically to make our submissions easier. Okay, and any radio buttons I'll not have selected, and in any drop downs then I'll have the actually some kind of null or just selection. That doesn't have a value that I can code for. And so in my case, I'm only going to need 3 because I'm not going to validate pain level, but I will do the requirements to have at least one with multi-checks and then one that adds. And I'll show you these 2 now before I move on. So for mine, they have to enter an energy value. So if they enter nothing here, now remember, you have no validate on your form. So in this case, it should throw, and let me just go ahead and let that run and get rid of that. So in this case, it's not valid. Energy score must be between 0 and 100. Okay, so if I put 1 in here, okay, so then in this case my logic, and I do still have an invalid, but now that passes my logic. So it has to be a value and it has to be between 0 and 1. So this was multi-level checks. And this is where I had pretty much gotten the logic that I wanted, but this is where, and you'll hear me talking about this, right? Include any sources that you did not write yourself. Like I wrote 90% of that logic for this one, but I did go through and get some suggestions to make it a bit better. But what you really want to do here, and in my README file, I'd want to say, yeah, I used, like I would show it in the documentation. Here's what I wrote. I got some help, and here's what I came out with. Okay, so what it really is showing is how much you're leaning into the Gen AI. Okay, so in this case, coming back up here, right, this is a multi-logic check. So this one was here that I did that with. So, and you can also see here, I've already implemented something we've done already, which is the clearing, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So in this case, what I ended up doing was I didn't change my decision code, but what I allowed the user to do was actually just to select whatever the current day is, okay? And so in that case, I'm adding functionality, right? So when I say here, right, it's not adding decision logic, but it's adding functionality. So what you want to do is when you document these things, talk about which ones, what does your multi-logic checks look like, right? And I gave you an example, but I just showed you an example. And then one has to be either adding functionality or decision logic. And so what you want to do is document those. Now, can you come back later and update it? Sure. Any of these that you find that you need to add, you've modified, it's okay. As long as I can follow the flow of what you're doing, that's the most important thing. So let me show you how this one works. Okay, so in this case, it does pass. Okay, now I still have one here, and this just is does it exist or not? Okay, so now I know I am going to get this, but in this case, because I'm recording this on Wednesday, if I was to say select, now I'm passing validation, right? And so for me, if I looked in the form data, I could see what it calculated, but I could also just come down here and hit edit, and then I would see that that does indeed repopulate correctly, okay? So whatever you end up doing, you just want to document those things and make sure you have, now you have 3 total, but 2 I have requirements specific to what I want them to be, okay? So you'll have to give this, definitely this is something, reach out if you want to talk about. Okay, so I have the point values underneath here. So now once you have your plan, then you update your HTML and CSS. And yeah, you can use that error class that we use on the carbon footprint and put in the, the form attribute of do not call validation, right? Do not call HTML validation. That's the no validate. Okay, so in this case, make sure you've gone through and also I didn't say this, but I did as well. When I set this up, I put in some sample text so that I could see if my placement of my error messages was correct. So then you create your DOM references, right, for your form validation errors, and code your basic form logic in form submission, so the function itself and then the form submission. And then follow the standards we've learned in the carbon footprint. Okay, so in this case, your form validation DOM reference and your basic logic. And this includes that validate function and then inside your submit handler. Okay. Now you're going to code, right? So code and test rule 1, 2, and 3. Now, if you want to do a few more, you're welcome to do it. These are the most important ones I will look at. And I know some of you have done more inputs, so, I think it's good to do more, but at minimum, you have to do 1, 2, and 3 that meet the requirements I talked about above, okay? Okay, so, and make sure they run. Make sure they actually do, like I just showed you on mine, that they do what you want. Okay, so now coming back here, right? Now, also add your clear error message function and implement to handle invalid and valid form submissions. And we did that. We just did that in this last assignment, so that should be pretty straightforward. Now, and I give them point values for each of these, so you can use the form validation standards we've implemented in the carbon footprint. Include any sources of code you did not write yourself. And I just gave you an example of how I did this, where I had written logic for this one, and like I said, and I would in my README, I would say 85 to 90% of it I wrote. I then went and got some help, and this is what came out of it. Because just using AI, it doesn't help you reason about. I mean, that's one of the things that I enjoy about coding, is actually getting the logic and writing that and thinking through it and having my brain have that experience. Okay, code with a console log errors or will not be graded, so your code has to run. Now, in this case, you may have written validation, but it actually doesn't work the way you want it, and that's where I would highlight. And many of you are already submitting early, which is really helpful, okay? Because then I can give you that feedback and you can fix it. Okay, so this is the step 5, implementing form validation into our app. And again, keep in mind everything we've had in the style code that we just, um, yeah, the style guide that we just implemented. Keep all those things in mind, so I don't want to see any alerts. Make sure you name your functions and variables camel case. Make sure you code is well formatted. I mean, that's just as easy as going through, right, and saying, you know, format my code, format that selection to make sure that looks good. It's because it makes your code easier to read. All right, hope this helps. Reach out for help if you need it.